Hey guys, Dr. Snellgrove here, recording from home. And I gotta say, I never realized what a cellar dweller I was until I saw how dim the lighting was compared to the fluorescent lighting at work. Anyways, just recording a quick video for our tech report writing class about oral reports. So this is starting on page 306 in our textbook. Some of this may be common sense, some of it maybe not as much. But this does tie intimately into what our third major assignment is. So as always, I encourage you to pay close attention to it. Now, the good news, I try to be a glass half full kind of guy for the most part. And so the good news here is that a lot of this relatively short chapter covers things that you should already be pretty familiar with from previous chapters or just from your previous experience. Things about understanding your audience, modulating your message for the audience, and all that kind of stuff. So I'll try not to dwell too much on the stuff that I feel like we've covered before, but I will try to draw attention to things that are new and or things that I think are especially pertinent to what you're doing for the third major assignment. All right. So if you look on bottom of page 306, going to the top of 307, they have some good advice here on like, what do you do in the intro? It's like get the audience interested, and then also get into the points you're going to cover. Like, hey, I'm going to cover the following 5 points. But I'm glad that they led off with, make it interesting. I just got done talking to a composition class about that. But, you might be the smartest person, have the most interesting stuff, but if you don't make it sound interesting from the very beginning, you've lost them. I always forget the exact number of seconds, but there's some really cheerful research out there about like how long it takes the average person to make up their mind about a new person. And so like 3 seconds or something crazy. So there is a kind of an analog to that when you are giving an oral presentation where people kind of make their minds up about you right away. And so you want to obviously strike a good impression. We're going to get into some stuff to do that, but also just in terms of like what you cover, how you cover it, making it sound interesting. Everybody has sat through a boring presentation. Some of you are like, I'm doing that right now. So you want to do your best to make things interesting when you can. All right. So it talks about help your audience pay attention and track your progress by numbering each point as you cover it. And this felt to me like a close kinship to something I always recommend to, composition students writing essays. They're like, how should I start my paragraphs off, Dr. Snellgrove? And I'm like, well, it's not the only way to do it, but my own writing like that, I'm usually like, the first reason we need to blah, blah, blah. The second reason we need to blah, blah, blah. And it helps keep the writer organized. If you're ever worried about your thoughts kind of straying as you're creating stuff, but also, of course, the primary thing, it keeps your reader nice and organized. They can follow along, the same way they do in, reading, a paper or a report. They can do this as you verbally go over, the first point, the second point, just makes it easier for them to understand. All right. So here's something that's a little different from, maybe a lot different from writing your papers. They have some good advice here saying that you should basically verbally tell your audience when you are reaching your conclusion. In conclusion, or this brings us to my conclusion, wrapping things up, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I say different because I and many of my colleagues have often told students, like, please don't say in conclusion to start your conclusion off. It's just very cliche. But when you are giving an oral report, people are basically waiting for those sort of verbal triggers there. So it's like, yes, once they hear in conclusion, people will perk up like, oh, they're finishing up now. Okay. And then here's another one that is perhaps very different from, when you're writing essays for different classes. Keep the presentation as short as possible. So just to keep us all honest, our own oral report assignment will have some kind of arbitrary, like, must be X minutes long, must cover Y, subject matter, that kind of thing. But out there in the real world, I think I've joked about it in previous videos. It's a lot like Kevin from The Office. Why use many word when few word do trick? Why, if you can do a 4-minute presentation, there's no reason on God's earth to make it an 8-minute presentation. All right. So if you look on 307, we're talking about understanding the speaking and writing relationship. And so some of this, a lot of this actually, this is what I was alluding to when I said, things you're probably pretty familiar with. Like, analyze your audience, know what they will expect. I think we've talked about that before. Like there's a difference between giving a presentation to your team and giving a presentation to the CEO. It's like they know different things. They're probably looking for different sets of information, and it's going to adjust what you share and how you share it, right? Articulate your purpose clearly. So this is sort of an extension of what we were doing, with the technical reports on, hey, why are you doing this? They need to know. Develop sufficient and appropriate supporting material. So especially in an oral report, you can't just wait for people, take my word for it. Source, trust me, bro. You want to have good, relevant, topic specific research to help you underscore your points. I think we've talked about that before. And in the classic, composition style, that's basically your ethos. It's kind of like a don't take my word for it. Let's see what this research has to say. All right. So understanding the context in which audiences will receive your presentation. That's again writing for the real world. Or is the context like, hey, I'm just keeping people informed about some changes? Is this like, hey, we need to collectively come up with a decision? What are we going to do about XYZ, et cetera, et cetera. Organizing material so your audience can follow your points. Again, that's just like writing a paper, just like creating a speech, just like organizing things. If nothing else, you can always organize things from the order of least important to most important. That's called emphatic order. And of course, if you are recommending, maybe you're talking about a series of recommendations. We need to do this, and then this, and then this. Chronological order would obviously be logical. Let's talk about the first thing you want to do, then the second thing, and so on. All right. It talks about choosing the level of language and formality suitable to both your role and your audience and your purpose. And so, again, that goes back to the idea of, I think we've talked about this before on videos, but the idea of code switching, right? You speak a certain way, to your friends, and then you speak a different way to your significant other, and you probably speak a different way to your boss, to your parents, all this kind of stuff. So that's that idea of like, who am I actually addressing this report to? That's going to determine exactly how formal, I get with this. When you're giving a presentation to your team, there's kind of like just one of the guys. You might make some jokes, references, get a little silly with it, and then it's like, oh, I've got to prepare a report for the CEO and his entire executive suite. Like, that's probably gonna be a lot more formal right there. Probably not a lot of in jokes. Probably just getting right to the point with that crowd. All right, analyzing the audience, and again, a lot of this covers stuff that you're already, I think, familiar with, where you got to figure out how much your audience knows about the subject, because that informs how much you cover. How much do they know about me? I guess it's worth keeping that in mind. Like, do you need to introduce yourself? I personally don't think, one way or another, I don't think introductions should be very long in an oral report. But there's a difference between I'm introducing myself to my team, aka I need no further introduction, or I'm introducing myself to people that have never seen me before. I might need more of an introduction. The book doesn't make this super explicit, but they're like, what do they expect from me, and how much interest will they have in what I will explain? So what I sometimes tell people is that's kind of like, do you need to goose anything up? If you are giving a presentation on something that's kind of a dry topic, that might, depending on your style, be an opportunity. Like, let's get some jokes in there. Let's throw a few things in there to liven stuff up. But if you have a topic that you feel like is naturally relevant, naturally interesting to that audience, that part won't be quite as big a deal. There's lots of stuff, what's their attitude? What's their age group? What positions do they occupy? Are they my bosses? Are they my subordinates? Are they, on my level? What is their educational background, cultural, ethnic background, economic background, political and religious views? What kind of biases will they have towards me and my topic? So some of y'all, if you're being honest, probably like, it's a lot of stuff for me to figure out before I give a presentation. But what that mostly translates to, reading between the lines, like writing in the real world, is, hey, you want to try not to accidentally offend anyone. very few people go out of their way in a formal like workplace presentation to offend people. But if you know you're giving a presentation to the CEO and you know he's a devout Catholic or something, you probably don't want to blurt out Jesus when your PowerPoint is acting up. It's one of those weird little things. It's like if you don't know much about that person, you might end up, getting in some hot water without even meaning to. And it sounds snobby, but like, what is their educational background? That can sometimes determine like mostly how much or how little do I have to explain certain things. And I would say not just formal education like college, but like how educated are they in the subject? Is this a group of veterans at your workplace? Like, as in they've been there a while? You probably don't need to explain as much to them. Is this a group of new hires? You probably have to explain everything to them, and so on. But yeah, let's see. So what is the goal? If you look on 308, what is the goal? Oh, I guess I skipped over one thing. This doesn't really matter quite as much to the way we're doing our oral report assignment, but it's saying that like you got to figure out if you're, are you using visual aids and what are they? Like, is it just you and a piece of paper talking? Nothing wrong with that. Is it you with a PowerPoint? Okay, well, y'all have already done a PowerPoint. So as you know, it's like, am I adding little animations? What kind of images am I doing? The idea being that you want the visual elements to enhance what you are saying rather than distract from what you are saying. All right, now on 308, if you look at determining the goal of your presentation, again, it's just like you have a purpose and you work your way backwards from that. This is exactly what y'all are doing with your technical report, right? That big assignment. It's like, okay, I'm making a recommendation on that particular assignment, but we've also talked about, there can be reports, there can be, which can include oral reports on, hey, I'm just providing, information, versus I'm making an explicit recommendation, any of that fun kind of stuff. So it's like, what are you trying to get them to do? And then you sort of work your way backwards from that. Like, just as a real world example, I've been in the position where I had to like, break in a presentation, break bad news. Like I knew the room was going to hate it. And it's like, all right, goal is to get them to at least not hate, this new thing that we're doing. And that's everything at that point. I was like, all right, everything must be in service of that goal. I'm going to monitor my language, how I frame and phrase certain things, because I'm trying to win these people over. And just like when you're writing an argumentative paper or anything else, like once you know a bit more about your audience, like, hey, I'm giving this presentation to my coworkers or something, a bit more about how to win them over. All right. So they have a bit here, choosing and shaping content. And it's like, all right, the most basic level, the first bullet point on there, what info and how much info you need to achieve your purpose. So I think I joked about it before, but there is such a thing as death by PowerPoint, like, or information, I sometimes call it information overload, where it's like, all right, I'm actually sharing a little too much. I'm giving them too much to keep up with instead of enough. So that's the idea, is finding, it's easier said than done, but finding that kind of balance there on, okay, I've given them just enough info to achieve my goal. And not more than that, not any more than that, if you can avoid it. Choose info that will interest your audience, politely challenging or supporting their attitudes and opinions about the subject. So they give some basic examples here, like you might be surprised to discover, or you might appreciate hearing. And so what this does in a completely unsubtle way is try to get your audience involved in this. There's a perception when someone listens to a speaker, usually in a workplace setting, like almost an us versus them mentality. I gotta listen to this guy drone on and on. And again, some of y'all are like, that's happening right now that you mention it. Uh, so, but it's like, all right, well, what can you do to kind of win them over? Some of this is, if you like, hey, you guys might appreciate that they started implementing your suggestions on blah, blah, blah. And so that helps you establish a rapport with people, helps them kind of let their guard down. It's like, hey, he knows about us or she knows about us. That automatically makes them like you a little bit more. But they also point out that you can do that kind of polite pushback. So like, oh, you might think that the best way to close a major account sale. However, and then that kind of makes people perk up like, I don't know, and sometimes I like that your book used that word challenging because sometimes that gets people to pay more attention because they're like, I bet I still know better. And sometimes it gets people's attention because I guess I need to learn. But either way, they're paying attention to what you have to say. And that's kind of the whole goal. All right. And then they have a thing here, including a variety of information like stats, testimony, cases, illustrations, history, and narratives that help you convey the goal you have for your presentation. I think I've mentioned it before, and it is probably the most tired like professor analogy ever. But a lot of this is basically like you are, what do you call it? You're arguing a case. You got to win over a jury of your peers. You got to win multiple people over. And so because it's winning multiple people over, the people in the room, it's like, all right, one thing might work for these two people, one thing might work for these three people, one thing might work for these two other people over here. So the idea of including different kinds of evidence, different kinds of research, there's multiple purposes to that, right? One, it helps establish your ethos, your authority, your credibility. Like, hey, you've done your homework, you know all about this stuff. But it also, on a rhetorical level, as I was just saying, like different things are going to win different people over in different ways. So when you bring a whole lot of evidence out like this, there's probably a nicer term for this, but I always call that the shotgun method. We're just big old blast here. We're hoping we're going to hit something. Throw out as much evidence as we can to win over as many people as we can. All right. So bottom of 308, going to the top of 309, talks about what is the context that you need to understand and how that will change your message. So it's like, what broader concerns underlie the need for your presentation? So for instance, if well, this is not an if, I've had to do this before, like giving, presentations about student enrollment. Is it up or is it down? And that's what I would be tasked to give a presentation on. It's enrollment. But what is the underlying issue there? The budget. More students means more money for the college. Fewer students means less money for the college. And so, I'm aware of that when I give these presentations, and it helps me, I keep saying this, but like modulate, what I say and how I say it. Any immediate issues underlie the presentation, that can be almost anything related to current events, tension in the workplace. The idea is just to underscore like your presentation doesn't live in a vacuum. If you're giving a workplace presentation, it's taking place in the same places. All the drama, all the weird little concerns, everything that might pop up in the workplace. And so you want to ideally not make anything worse with your oral report, but in some cases you might be able to use some of the tension to your advantage. We were talking about getting people on your side. So if everybody's worried about some upcoming merger, that can be part of your oral report. All of us are worried about the merger, but you might be pleasantly surprised to discover that. So just like that, you can turn their tension and anxiety into a reason to pay attention to you. All right. How does your presentation relate to these issues? You need to know that, even if you don't explicitly draw those links. That's something you need to know as you're preparing your report. What will be occurring in the organization at the time you make your presentation? Is it just another day? You're just giving some info to some people? Or is it like, hey, this is the first part of, I'm the first speaker in a series of speakers at a special event. Speaking of which, if you are one of several speakers, what kinds of presentations will other speakers make? It sounds so silly and almost high schooly, but there is such a thing as like, we accidentally ended up making the same presentations mostly about the same topic. Whoops. So just a surface level awareness of what's going on there can keep y'all from stepping on each other's toes. And then in what surroundings will you make the presentation? And so the book doesn't really get into lots of details there, but in my experience, that mostly comes down to like, hey, am I going to be in a room I'm familiar with, like using maybe a computer I'm familiar with, or like for me, I might be in an academic conference. Like, crap, I got to figure out their computer, I got to figure out their projector. There's a lot of things that could go wrong. Not that you can't address these things, not that you can't take steps to protect yourself, but only if you, only if you think about this and look into it ahead of time. All right. So the good news is 309, I think we're going to go pretty fast on that because it's talking about how do you organize your information. We've already talked about this, but it's like, all right, there's usually, this is kind of the middle of 309, three distinct parts of your oral presentation, which are going to sound a lot like a paper, intro, a body, and a conclusion. So intro has to tell the audience subject and purpose of your presentation. The body develops the points stated in the introduction. Conclusion must reiterate the ideas presented and reinforce the purpose of the presentation. So this is not the only thing, of course, that you could ever give an oral report on, but let's say that you were doing an oral report, kind of like the recommendations you were making for the second project. It's like, okay, well, in my intro of my oral report, I'm going to make the recommendation like, hey, this is what we need to do. And that lets my audience know this is my purpose. And now the rest of my oral report until I get to the conclusion is laid out a lot like an argumentative paper. The first reason we need to do this, the second reason we need to do this. And so it's just building that. So I don't know if y'all are sick of me making these little comparisons here, but I like to remind you that like you probably either already have a lot of these skills or at least you're familiar with many of the concepts that go into making a good oral report. All right. And then I've never been big on this kind of outlining, but towards the very bottom of page 309, they talk about like, hey, you can now that you have Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3, you can flesh those out. Even when I was in high school, I kind of hated that. So you might notice when I have you submit outlines, they're far simpler than that. That's fine. All right. So I mean, they have some stuff bottom of 309, go to 310, like some extra stuff you might want to throw into an intro for an oral report. Like, hey, you got an interesting opening statement, a famous quote, a funny anecdote. The idea, as they put on here, is just to engage people right away. We've been talking about that from the very beginning. That you might be the smartest person in the world, you might be giving one of the most, you might be presenting on one of the most interesting topics in the world. But if you can't make it sound interesting, none of that matters. They're going to tune out right away. All right. So we mentioned this earlier, but state how you will proceed in your presentation, which is just like, I'm going to cover the 5 following topics. And it sounds weird because like that's the kind of stuff that you don't do. Don't do that in a paper. Like, in this paper, I will. I've told somebody, don't do this. Don't do that. Just go ahead. But now here in an oral report, people that might or might not have any kind of visual aid to go along with your report are going to be waiting for those sort of verbal cues where you're like, I will cover these 5 points. You can imagine somebody, writing their notes as like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it helps them follow along. So the body is just developing the argument or developing whatever you're discussing, whatever you broach in the intro. They do bring in include at least one example or anecdote for each point to make your ideas more vivid and memorable. And so the book tiptoes up to this and doesn't quite say it, but what they're dealing with there is, or what they're addressing there, human psychology. And I'm not just saying this as a guy with a PhD in English. We are hardwired to love stories more than almost anything else. And so it's like, hey, sure, you can give just a basic argument supporting your position and maybe they'll even remember it. But they'll really remember it if you can combine that story, or I'm sorry, that argument with an interesting story from your own life, an interesting anecdote, an example of what happened to someone else somewhere. That really helps solidify it in the mind. All right. And then the conclusion, just reviewing the key issues you want audience to remember, but in a shortened, concise manner. We've talked about this before, back just talking about, putting your PowerPoints together. But the idea is, how to put this, a conclusion, you need to accommodate both the people that didn't catch everything that you were talking about before and those who did. So the conclusion is a perfect, if you were like, I'm going to cover these 5 points, then you can give the 5 points again in the conclusion. That helps the people that might have missed something or didn't catch a certain detail, helps them out. At the same time, though, you need to consider, like, some people have been paying close attention. Some people have been taking notes, and you can't just turn your conclusion, like we're doing the entire paper all over again. I'm sorry, the entire oral report all over again. So you need to keep things short and to the point. All right. So I feel like we already talked about a lot of this on 310, so we'll get into it. But it's talking about first, when you're trying to choose how you're going to, what is your speaking style? How are you going to address these people? You need to figure out, like, does the audience actually know me? How do they feel about me? Are these like my equals in the organization? Are they subordinates? Are they superiors? We talked about that before. And so it's like, how much do they know about the subject matter? It might be a superior, but you're the expert on it. You need to know that. But every now and then you're covering the surface level stuff, new events for someone who is a subject matter expert. You need to know that too. And then what behaviors and interactions does your organization usually expect from individuals giving oral presentations? Translation. Don't look like a damn weirdo when you're giving your presentation. If there's kind of like an unofficial house style to oral reports, you don't necessarily want to come in and turn this into a comedy routine. But if the oral reports tend to have funny anecdotes and energetic speakers, you want to try to match that vibe as much as you can. All right. And so they have a handy thing down here as we become more and more of a global workforce. What if you were giving a presentation to a group of people, most of whom are from other countries? And it's like, okay, you're giving the presentation in English, sure, but there are certain things you can do with your speaking style. Maybe earlier we're talking about modulating your style based on like, these are these are my colleagues. I'm going to make some jokes. That's my boss. Maybe not as much stuff like that. But here it's like, hey, generally speaking, you want to speak more slowly. Although some would say that here in the South, we have that one down pat. Avoid idiomatic expressions. So I have an example like, it was a piece of cake. It cost an arm and a leg. And I'm glad that they put that in here because normally, if you were giving a presentation to people that, are all from the same country, your country, yeah, idioms are a great way to show like you speak the language. You're one of them. But if you're speaking to a room full of people that don't all have the same, general cultural background, yeah, they may not understand those idioms and they'll just get lost trying to figure them out. Using short sentences, limiting each sentence to one idea, and displaying more words on slides to allow the audience to read and listen at the same time. So this is the one exception, right? Previously, we've talked about how you don't want to have text overload on your PowerPoints or whatever. But yeah, if you've got like a bunch of people where English is, maybe a second language, maybe a distant, tertiary language or something like that, they will very often have an easier time reading than listening. So that's the one time where you might want to have a little more info, a little more text in your PowerPoint slides, because they'll have an easier time figuring that out than they'll have listening to you. But for the record, for our own oral report, we are assuming you are giving that to a room full of native speakers. All right. And whew, I feel like this is largely redundant, so I may go through it quick. This last page anyway, 311. So it's talking about like if you are using slides to enhance the purpose and meaning. Basically, like as we said earlier, are you giving an oral report which is like you and maybe some speech notes, or is this something where it's like, hey, I've got a PowerPoint presentation or something else going behind me? So it's like, all right, how do you basically, long story not very short, how do you properly combine the visual and spoken elements? All right, so number one, this is in the middle of 311. Like I said, unless it happens to be a room full of people from different countries, limit the information on any given slide. Normally people don't want, if somebody is already like very fluent in American English, then it can actually be distracting because they're trying to listen to you and they're trying to read the two giant paragraphs you crammed into that one slide or whatever. So you want to limit the info on a slide. Choosing a friendly font. They throw out Helvetica, Arial, Times, etc. Skip the unconventional options that could distract, which is basically like, please don't do Comic Sans. I don't do anything, y'all deserve that. All right. Limit the type fonts you use to 2 per slide. This one, I'll be honest, this advice kind of took me by surprise. I'm like, are people really changing their fonts that much in presentations? I guess implicitly, yes. So try to use no more than 2, per slide, and try to make it like, try to create a pattern. Like I'm using this font for headers and this font for text or something like that. Don't just be flipping them out and weirding the reader out, or weirding the audience out, I should say. Font sizes should be consistent. Don't use all capital letters. Some of this, I mean, we talked about this back on your original PowerPoint. Use a background that does not distract from the text or illustrations. Dark type on a plain light background is usually the easiest to read. So that's your catch 22, right? They just said like black text on white background, easy to read. But one of the things we talked about before, just a plain, you didn't do anything to a white background, can look a little boring. Some of y'all are looking at the white background behind me, like, yeah, it does look kind of boring. So, you want something that's not quite that, but I mean, there's lots of ways you can, I don't want to say cheat, but like a cream colored background, a daisy background, daisy yellow background, something like that, where, it can still be a pop of color. So it's not just completely unadorned white, but then the dark coloring shows up against it. I had a few people that were doing like light text on light backgrounds for the early parts of the presentation. I was like, I can't see any of this. All right. And then, of course, the little thing here, don't crowd the information on your slide. Blank space will make your slides easier to read and your ideas easier to understand. So basically, this is, again, I keep making these comparisons. I don't know if it's weirding you guys out, but the idea here being like, all right, in an essay, students sometimes get in survival mode, like, I got to write as much as possible to hit the page count or the word count. But now it's like, all right, if you are creating visual elements to go along with your oral report, the oral report, your words, your spoken words, that's the main part of this. Everything else is just an extra. So when it comes to the slides, it's fine to embrace like negative space would be the artistic term for that, to help these things stand out. And you want to consider other things too. Like I think early on, I got on to people about don't have butting headers, where it's like two headers that are right next to each other, like they're about to fight it out. Instead, like, a header here and a header here. It may sound weird, it may look weird watching me hold my fist up like this, but at least the information won't be competing with each other as the reader reads each one. Whew, I think that's about everything. Thank you for putting up with the delay. I had to move my office, and thank you for putting up with me looking vaguely satanic in the dark lighting here at the home office. But one thing that hasn't changed, if you have any questions about your projects, about the syllabus, about the class, about anything, feel free to email me or feel free to text me at 863-835-2399. Y'all have a good one. Bye.